Hi, welcome back to Lakeside Quilt Making Arts. We're not lakeside today. It's cold and sleeting out there. No snow just yet, but we're expecting it. I could go to the park. It's probably safe enough to drive, but knowing me, I'd find an icy patch and I'd slide and fall, and that's not an activity I'm welcoming today. Today, we're just going to decide to quilt, right? That's what we should do on these kind of gloomy days. Today we're going to talk about the Quilt Show's Block of the Month 2024, and it's the Pick a Petal by Jen Kingwell. Make sure I get her name right. I am. And it's a lovely quilt, right? I mean, it's a really pretty quilt. I'm trying to do it all hand by hand like she did hers. Barbara Black with the Quilt Show is demonstrating how to do it by machine, which I do love the productivity of doing anything by machine. But for me, I really was intrigued by how Jen demonstrated on the Quilt Show, where they interviewed her, where she demonstrated how to do it by hand. And I thought this would be the right one for me to just kind of have on the back burner, to try to, have something that kind of slowed me down a little bit, something that was more peaceful and increased my skill sets and that kind of thing. And it's doing that, but what I'm finding is that there's nothing back burner about it because it is taking much longer, especially with this first thing you're doing is this center medallion, this little block in the middle. There's enough learning curve there for me and enough little starts and stops that it's taking more time. But I also wanted to do this because in my mind, it's helping me to keep my hands nimble. They're not great at that. They get stiff, my thumbs and wrists do. While I still can, if my hands get worse and I can't, I want to at least have one quilt that I have done from start to end that's all been hand done. This one will be going to my granddaughter, and so I think it's really sweet that I'll have a gift for her that is hand done, something that just shows a little extra touch of intentionality for her, and that it indicates the amount of time that went into it. But hands down, I am not giving anybody any grief over sewing on a machine. I love my machine, and I love machine piecing and machine quilting. I just wanted to do something by hand. So with all that caveat said, let's get into the goods of this video. There's many parts to this. First I had to do the templates, and then I had to figure out how to cut the holes in the templates, because these templates are registered with holes that you can put when you buy the templates from the Quilt Show, they're registered with little holes on them so that you can stick a fine point pin through and mark your intersection points for your piece of fabric, so that you know where to sew to, because when you're hand sewing, you leave your seam allowances open. So I had a big learning curve there, and I made a video about that and put that up last week. And then I had to figure out, okay, now that I've got my templates, how do I get my piece of fabric cut out? Because this is all new for me. I'm on a learning curve. I'm the novice learning something new here. So how do I manage that? I had to figure out, okay, I am not using my rotary cutter up against my acrylic or plastic template that I've made. It's stronger than paper, but it still would nick up my rotary cutter and I would destroy my template in a heartbeat. So, okay, you gotta trace it. Okay, light bulb went off pretty quickly, and I started tracing them, and then I cut it out by scissors. That was an enjoyable process too. I like seeing it kind of come together. It is seriously a much slower process. But the thing about it, as it is a slower process than the sewing machine, I can't imagine doing those little arcs where you put the fan blades up against the concave arc of, I don't know what you call it, the base of the fan. I'm sure it's got a name, and everybody else probably knows what it is, and I'll have to look it up. It's such a tiny little thing to try to do that on a sewing machine and keep everything laying in place just right. I think I'd probably end up heavily pinning it, and then I might as well sew it, and because it really didn't take long to put that together. So I think I might have, even if I were machine piecing this thing, I might still do that part by hand, just because I think it's more accurate. But with that word said, accurate is not what it is. like there's some deviances here in my arcs. One in particular looks kind of rough. They're not too bad, and I think I'm getting better as I'm going. I'm trying to remember, because I saw Jen do it on the quilt show, that whenever you're stitching your two pieces together, that you're taking your seam allowance on the back or on the front, wherever it is, and you're pulling it out of the way. As you're approaching that seam allowance with your threaded needle to make more running stitches, then you pull that seam allowance out of the way. Then whenever to cross that seam allowance line to the other side, then you fold that seam allowance back, hold it in the other direction, and your needle goes in right beside it, like, you know, just a thread's width away from where you made that last one. And that secures your seam allowance, and it leaves it also free on the ends. Your fabric feels so much more frail when you're hand sewing, and I can take some pretty small hand sewing stitches. I've kind of been intentionally not taking my smallest because I know I can get a little bit not OCD about it, but a little neurotic about how tiny can I make my stitches. So I've been trying to make a normal size stitch, and so your fabric isn't what it would be coming off of the sewing machine, and that's causing me to feel like I'm doing it wrong. But mind over matter. I know this is how it's supposed to be. And then when you see the ends of your seam allowances are open because you've stopped your sewing up against that dot that you've made from your template, that also makes it feel like it's a more frail piece. So I've been trying to secure a couple extra stitches right there at the tip where those dots are, just to make sure that I don't do all this work and then something starts unraveling. I don't want that. But there's also that concept of, well, that'll quilt out. I've been using that a little bit in my head. I just learned that is a phrase amongst quilters in the last month or so. And there's a lot of validity to it, because as I look at it, I think, okay, that arc, how much am I gonna care if that arc is not exactly, you know, a smooth arc? How much am I going to care if my center points are not precise? Now, if I was on the sewing machine, I think I could get all those points in the middle. I think I could get them pretty lined up. Maybe I should do it before I start boasting with any confidence that I can do it. But I think I could do better than I did by hand. But I'm still pleased, relatively pleased how I did it by hand, even though I think I would do better if I were to redo it today, because I learned some things while I was doing it. Looking at the imperfections of where those 8 points of the star blades meet, I'm looking at it thinking, that's gonna quilt out. And also, there's that other expression that we quilters use about if you're 100 feet away on a galloping horse, are you gonna see it? I don't know who came up with that. I've heard, what is her name from Missouri Star? Jenny Doan, is that her name? I've heard her say that, and I thought it was something she just made up. But whoever made it up, that's the rule I'm going by on this, because my star points are not perfect. But by the time you get quilting in there, it's going to be fine. But that quilting is also going to take care of my other problem that I have, the other challenge I have mentally, that it feels like it's more frail. The quilting will secure all those stitches. But that also tells me that I can't have a super loose quilting on this if I'm gonna be mentally relying on those quilting stitches to provide security to my seams. We're a long ways away from worrying about that. Let's see how this thing goes together. One of the things I had to freshen my motor skills about was threading a tiny needle. Fortunately, last year when I was putting together a quilt, what did I call it? The Grand Wonderments is what I called it. And it was to commemorate a trip to the Grand Canyon with some family friends. So I had done a lot of embroidery on that one. I wasn't doing great at the time. I was, in waiting to have some surgeries done, and so my eyesight was just constantly blurry. So I had to look up some tips on threading needles. I'm so glad I did, because I found Sarah Humphrey, her embroidery channel. Oh my gosh, she is a delight. What she does is fantastic. I wish I had this much of her skill. So I looked her up, and she taught me like in seconds what I've struggled to do all the times I've been, in my adult life trying to sew. She taught me how to thread a needle. You take that thread and you cut a little sharp point on it. You never lick it, never put it in your mouth, never wet it. That just makes sure the fibers kind of blow up a little bit, and that's going to be counterproductive to getting that thread through the eye of your needle. So you take that between your fingers, you put your thread up in there, and you cut a sharp little tip. You pull it way down to where you can almost not even see it. Then you take the eye of your needle and you wiggle that onto it, and it works. It's ridiculous. If you loosen your grip on your thread, it works less effectively, and it's kind of a counterintuitive thing. You think that you've got to make room for that needle because you're trying to wiggle it down, but you need to keep a firm grip on your thread while you do it. And generally, I get it in the first go, and that's without being able to see the eye of the needle. My vision gets blurry from time to time, not only because of the bifocals or low light or whatever, but it gets blurry. And so I can't always predict that I can see that finely. This threading technique works for me, so I was hoping that it might be a good tip for you too. What are my challenges so far with this quilt? One of them has been learning how to do the Y inset seams. Of course, the arc, putting the fan blades on the arc, that was my first little bit of learning curve, and that went smoothly enough. I learned a little bit, got a little bit of my confidence built up. I felt secure in what I was doing when I started to put the block unit of the fan unit inside that Y seam to create that Y seam. And it went fine, but I had to teach myself, because I kept making the mistake of grabbing my seam as I approached it from the front, from the back with my needle, with my threaded needle. And so after a few times of securely locking down my seam allowance on the back, I started trying to train my brain, think ahead, feel with your fingers on the back where that seam allowance is, pull it out of the way, because you want flexibility and your seam allowances on this. And that's one of the beautiful things about hand quilting, is that you can do that, whereas you can't do that, not very easily anyway, with a sewing machine. Another learning curve for me that I don't have figured out yet is which way to press, and when to press open and when to press to the sides. To predict ahead where my seams, especially on a more complex block like this, where you've got arcs and you've got straight seams and you've got points all coming together, like how can I minimize any kind of bulk? And it's working out okay. Of course, that's the advantage of the hand quilting, because you're leaving those seam allowances open past that point of the dots. You're not sewing beyond that, and that gives you some flexibility. It's also created another learning curve, like I've said, about when I took the 4 star points on one side and the 4 star points on the other side, and I took those 2 units together so that I could make the entire star. There in the center, it was challenging, and it wasn't super challenging, but I was careful to be tedious about it, to make sure I pulled my seam allowance over, to make sure that whenever I got through with that one seam, it went over to the other side, and I dodged the next one, while also keeping your stitches small enough and that you're catching the front side to the back side, so that you're going to have a secure seam right there, which is, the objective, right? The last thing you want to do is your quilt to come apart at the very center. So it took me a little while to do that. I went over it a few different times. I wanted to make sure I was doing a good job and I was being thorough. I was very pleased when I opened it up and you could see all 8 of the star points hit. So all of my star points don't look perfect. I get that, and it is a little bit of a learning curve for me to try to accept that. But it's also, honestly, trying to look at it like I would look at it if it belonged to somebody else and it wasn't mine. It's fine. Like, I wouldn't notice, right? It's just fine. I can deal with it, and the quilting, like I said before, the quilting will quilt that out, and that's a good thing. So one of the things that I've been realizing, probably since I made the last video about this block, was I don't like the background colors that I chose. And I already had a couple of arcs sewn into my fan blades when I made that decision. And I tried to talk myself out of it. I thought, okay, number one, you've only done a couple of fan blocks, so groups of fan blocks onto an arc. Could you undo that? Yeah, but are you going to really care, Dawn? Maybe the white is fine. Maybe you don't like it because the white is on a white design board. Maybe once you get it embedded into the quilt, it's going to make a difference. You know, you get all these colors around it. And so I tried to live with it, and you know, I just pushed on. And then I was getting more and more discontent with the background color. It's just too neutral. It's just going to wash out. And I wanted something. I want this thing to just pop with color. So I think I'm changing the background. Now the little arcs for the fan blades, I'm going to keep those as that neutral white, which is that white on taupe with a really light taupe with white print on it. I'm going to keep that. I wish I had done that differently, but it's okay. It's not gonna keep me up at night. If I left this really light background on, it would mess with me. So what I did is I took it off the design board, put it on the floor where it's a dark contrast, and I like that. And then I thought, okay, if I put this background around it, and then there's a contrast around that lighter background like there would be in the finished quilt, all the colors from the finished quilt, then do I like that? And I still didn't like it enough. So I put on my design board some leftover fabric from the back of the Minnesota quilt that I did last month, and just pinned that up and started pinning my medallion, the center part of that medallion block onto it. And I love it. I love how it looks against a really saturated background. And then I thought, well, maybe this is another exercise. Maybe then once it's embedded in the quilt with a lot of color, then I could have the neutral, really light colored background around these fan blocks, and it will be fine. So I kind of mocked that up, and I don't like that either. What I do like, though, is that dark, saturated color. I'm not 100% certain that I want it to be that color, that hue, that blue. In my mind, I want it to be fuchsia, and I don't know why, and it's not just because it's going to a granddaughter versus a grandson. I want this quilt to be a blend of her mother and her father, so it's going to have, you know, interests of her father and interests of her mother in there. So color is not a gender consideration for this quilt whatsoever, but I still saw it as fuchsia, and I don't have any fuchsia, so I can't continue with this block until I go to the fabric store, or I decide that I'm happy with this really dark blue. So I might have to be really happy with this blue. I do like the fact that it is not a patterned fabric. That works well. I used it, like I said, I used it as the back for one of the Minnesota quilts, and I think it faded much more than my quilt store fabrics do. Normally I'm getting my fabrics from Quality Quilt Store in Huntsville. It's the Southern Charm, and I love going in that store. I love it. It's dangerous to go in that store, but I love it. I've gotten some from Joann's. I've gotten some from Walmart, and I made my first quilt after getting back into quilting last January. I made my first quilt from the Walmart fabrics, and it felt fantastic. And I've used some other Walmart fabrics, and the Joann fabrics are fine too. So I'm worried that this fabric may fade with this quilt. I don't remember how much it faded. I don't think it was a significant amount, but it did tell me that this fabric is not the same quality as my other quilt store fabrics, and the rest of them are quality ones I'm using. Like they're from Laundry Basket. Where else did I buy from? A Fat Quarter Shop, and then some from my quilt store in Huntsville. Not mine, but you know, the one I go to. So that's where I think we are on this. It's time now for me to see if I can wait until I can get some fuchsia saturated fabric to do that background. It's going to be a hard call. I really want to see this move forward, and I think this blue just may be the right thing. We're going to give it a go, most likely. What would you do? Tell me. And also, Talking about what would you do, I appreciate everybody who has been subscribing and commenting. It helps to support the channel, and I of course want to see this channel grow, so thank you for doing that, and thanks for spending your time with me. So that's it for this video, and I am glad you're here. Thank you very much. We'll see you soon. Bye.